Okay, well, welcome everyone to the 45th Annual Midwest Philosophy Colloquium on Conspiracy Theory. Tonight we are honored to have Charles Pigden from the University of Otago, where he's taught and has published on a wide variety of subjects, ranging from the analytic-synthetic distinction through truth-maker theory and the existence or otherwise of abstract objects to Jane Austen's Mr. Eliot. He's a well-known Russell scholar and also an expert on the philosophy of conspiracy theories, where he helped to revive the issue of the epistemology of conspiracy theories in the classic paper that many of our students read in the fall and discussed with Charles. All right, Charles, why don't you take it away from here?
Hello, everybody. I apologize for the inconvenience that my screen share facility doesn't seem to be working very well, which is causing us maybe some glitches, but we're going to have a go. So let's go to the first slide. I'll come to what it's all about in a minute. So first slide and introduction rule. You know what I hate? Philosophical papers which relate some matter of great political pith and moment to some arcane issue that's neither understandable by nor of any interest to anyone but professional philosophers. Their authors often operate under the grotesque delusion that they're thereby doing their duty as public intellectuals. I hate those kinds of papers, but I'm sorry to say this is just such a paper. I'm going to be drawing on Pryor's famous paper, The Runabout Inference-Ticket, plus some of Dummett's remarks in Frege, The Philosophy of Language, to argue that conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist are Tonkish terms. And I'm going to use this idea to clarify both the debate about conspiracy theories and perhaps, if we get around to it, the vexed question of inferentialism in the philosophy of logic. Now, in fact, this paper is going to be even worse than the preceding paragraph suggests. I'm not just going to relate conspiracy theories and their believability to some arcane issue that only philosophers care about or can understand. I'm going to relate conspiracy theories to an ultra-arcane set of issue which only a minority of philosophers either care about or can understand. Excuse me. I can assure you all, I've just got asthma. It isn't COVID. I've been tested. Obviously, if I am to retain some shreds of respectability as a public intellectual, I'm going to have to explain some of this arcane terminology, terminology that's not only unfamiliar to non-philosophers, but also unfamiliar to those philosophers with no particular interest in philosophical logic. Okay, I'm going to start with one technical term, which is inferentialism. What is that when it's at home? Well, inferentialism has many variants and has evolved over time, but for present purposes, we can sum it up the 1950s version of this view as follows. The idea is that the meanings of logical connectives, such as and, or, not, and if then, are not to be given by their truth conditions. That is, you don't define and as something that's the case if both A and B are true. Rather, nor do you define it by their assertability conditions. You don't say, oh, well, A and B is true if you can assert A and you can assert B. No. They are wholly to be understood in terms of the inferences that they license, and in particular, their introduction and elimination rules. Introduction rules tell you when it is okay, given a preceding set of sentences which function as premises, to introduce a new sentence containing the expression in question. Elimination rules tell you when it is okay, given a sentence or set of sentences containing the relevant expression, to move to a new sentence or set of sentences from which that expression has been eliminated. Thus, the meaning of and, first slide, please, and introduction, thus the meaning of and is wholly given by the following introduction and elimination rules. Here we have them. And introduction rule: from a premise A and a premise B, infer, that is to say, you're allowed or licensed to infer A and B. Or, I've got the logical terminology up there, but that's not really material in the current context. And there's an elimination rule. From the premise A and B, infer, that is, you are licensed to infer A. And from the premise A and B, infer, that is, you're licensed to infer B. Right? So we have an introduction rule. You've got a set of premises. You've got A and you've got B. And from that, you're licensed to infer A and B. And from A and B, you're licensed to infer A, and you're licensed to infer B. Okay, next slide is the OR introduction rule. And that says from a premise A, infer, that is, you're licensed to infer A or B. And from a premise B, you're also licensed to infer A or B. So that's the introduction rule. For the elimination rule is from a premise A or B and a premise not A, infer, that is, you're licensed to infer B, or from a premise A or B and a premise not B, infer, that is, you're licensed to infer A. Right? So we have introduction rules and we have elimination rules. How you're allowed to introduce an expression, and how you can, from a sentence involving that expression, eliminate it to arrive at new expressions. And the idea is that these rules totally characterize the meanings of the relevant connectives. All right. Once you understand these rules, you know all you need to know about OR and all you need to know about AND. So I'm going to quote Pryor because we'll be discussing his work. If we are asked what the meaning of the word AND, at least in its purely conjunctive sense, the answer is said to be completely given by saying that, one, from any pair of statements P and Q, we can infer the statement formed by joining P to Q by AND, which statement we shall hereinafter describe as a statement P and Q. And from two, from any conjunctive statement P and Q, we can infer P, and from P and Q, we can always infer Q. Anyone who's learnt to perform these inferences knows the meaning of AND, but there's simply nothing more to knowing the meaning of AND than being able to perform these inferences. Right? So the meaning of logical connectives, logical constants, logical expressions is wholly given by the introduction and elimination rules. And what these do is say, you can infer this from that. You can infer that from this. Understand what you're allowed to infer, and that's all the understanding you need to get a grasp of the logical connectives. Okay, now this is, and let's go to slide 4. This kind of logical inferentialism has obvious affinities with another popular view, a view that is popular in the 1950s and the 1960s, namely Wittgensteinian instrumentalism. Gosh, I've misspelled Wittgensteinian. The idea here is that generalizations and scientific laws and hypotheses are not genuine candidates for truth and falsehood, let alone descriptions of reality, but are inference tickets, licensing us to move from premises to conclusions, often premises concerning past observations, to conclusions consisting of future predictions. So a theory isn't a theory in the sense of a purported description of reality. It is an inference license, allowing us to go from premises of a certain kind to conclusions of another kind. It is a naive error to suppose that, for example, all swans are white is true if and only if all swans possess the property of whiteness. In fact, all swans are white is neither true nor false. Rather, it is an inference ticket that enables you to move from the premise Ziggy is a swan to the conclusion Ziggy is white. Now, I should say that this is no longer a very popular view, partly because it was decisively refuted by my former chief, Alan Musgrave, in a really terrific article entitled Wittgensteinian Instrumentalism. But it was popular for a while, and in particular, it was popular in Wittgensteinian circles from the 30s onwards. Now, here we have, this is slide 5, W.B. Watson, one of Wittgenstein's disciples, not to be confused with Alistair Watson, another of Wittgenstein's disciples who was probably a spy, writing disdainfully to the master about a lecture delivered in the United States by that pathetic old fossil, A.N. Whitehead. So here's the letter. I heard Whitehead in our physics lecture room speaking on the bearing of philosophy on science. He was awful. His place is in the pulpit, definitely. He actually cherishes the notion that philosophy is the source of new ideas and gave us all the old stuff about psychology and physiology and the most hellish muddle in his contacts with logic, the subject of which he was a co-creator, so to speak. He does not seem to realize that the words true and false cannot be used correctly about hypotheses. Indeed, he employs the argument there's nothing hard and fast about the truth of a scientific theory as a general excuse for woolliness and haziness. I'm glad you weren't there. Okay. Next slide. This goes with a good deal of sneering at the supposed nonsense of Stanley Baldwin, former Prime Minister and then Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. Isn't it pleasant to think that the Chancellor of Cambridge University is capable of the nonsense with which the newspaper credits him? There can't be any mistake in reporting, especially the paragraph I've marked. The atom bombardiers is typical of the American newspaper when it lets itself go. One of these days, I'm going to put forward a Freudian theory of all this mystery of mysteries stuff. So Baldwin had said, you know, that physicists investigate the mysteries of the universe. And to this, W.B. Watson takes Wittgensteinian exception. So moving to the next paragraph, sorry, the next slide. Well, Wittgenstein was not like Addison, according to Pope. One could not accuse him of hesitating dislike or assenting with civil leer. That wasn't his way. But certainly, with or without sneering, he taught the rest to sneer. There's a hell of a lot of this sneering in Watson's letters to Wittgenstein, in which he kind of curries favor by reporting instances of what, according to Wittgenstein's theories, would count as nonsense. Now, of course, if scientific theories really were mere inference tickets, then physicists couldn't discover the mysteries of the universe by developing well-confirmed theories about, say, the structure of the atom, since inference tickets cannot constitute discoveries. Next slide. But the idea of a modus tollens has clearly never occurred to Watson. If Baldwin's talk about the mystery of mysteries does make some kind of sense, and physicists can discover fundamental truths about the structure of the universe, then scientific theories are not mere inference tickets. Baldwin's talk about the mystery of mysteries does make some sort of sense, ergo. Well, on this, I must confess I'm at one with the dullard Stanley Baldwin as against Wittgenstein and Watson. Okay, so note the similarity here, right? Moving on to the next slide. What Wittgensteinian instrumentalism amounts to is the thesis that a scientific theory or hypothesis constitutes an immensely complicated set of introduction and elimination rules, though expressed in a deeply misleading way. So we shouldn't ask whether these theories are true, since for theories, generalizations, and hypotheses, truth is a conceptual impossibility, but whether following the rules leads to happy results. Though, how we should define happiness remains a moot point. Thus, Wittgensteinian instrumentalists take a theory which looks pretty dubious as an analysis of and blow it up into an interpretation of, say, Einstein's theory of relativity or Marx's theory of surplus value. Okay, next slide. Right, now enter at this point Arthur Prior. In the Runabout Inference-Ticket and in the sequel Conjunction and Conjunction Revisited, Prior develops a reductio of the view that the meaning of a logical connective such as and, if, then, or is determined by a set of inference licenses rather than the truth conditions of the propositions in which the expression appears. Right? This is a very famous paper of Arthur Prior's. There was a bit of a question about earlier on is why so many enthusiasts for the philosophy of conspiracy theory come from New Zealand and in the Antipodes more generally. Well, two things I could say here. In my own case, I got interested in it because there was a elderly ex-student of Popper's, who of course had taught at Christchurch, who was a retired brewer, and he was retained an interest in philosophy, used to attend the philosophy seminars, and from time to time he would invite the philosophers around to a drinking session in which we would consume his absolutely mind-numbing beer, which we would also soak up with really bad pizza prepared by his wife. And before we consumed the beer and soaked it up with the pizza, we were supposed to do a little party piece. So I thought, well, this is a pupil of Popper's. I'm kind of a Popper fan, and much more so than David Cody, I may say. And but here's something I think he's wrong about. So I composed the origins of my paper, Popper Revisited, as a 5-minute presentation before getting absolutely blotto on really strong beer. And then, when I'd sobered up the next day, it occurred to me that I could turn it into a publication. So that's how I got interested in it. The other thing, of course, is I'm talking about Prior. Prior is by far the most, by a narrow margin, I should say, the most distinguished graduate of the philosophy department at the University of Otago. He taught at Christchurch, but he was originally a graduate and taught first at the University of Otago. So, there's a personal connection here. Whether there's any kind of deeper ideological connection, I have no idea. Anyway, I've always thought that Prior's Runabout Inference-Ticket was the paradigm of a brilliant, brief, fundamental paper. I spent the other third of my career working on another brilliant brief paper, papers of Prior, his paper, The Autonomy of Ethics. But this is one of the 2 or 3 which are real game changers. Anyway, what's this paper all about? Let's go to slide 11. First, Prior sets up his target. And again, I'm going to go through this again, this passage. If we are asked what is the meaning of the word and, at least in its purely conjunctive sense, the answer is said to be completely given by saying that from any pair of statements P and Q, we can infer the statement formed by joining P to Q by and 2, from any conjunctive statement P and Q, we can infer P And from P and Q, we can also infer Q. And that's all there is to understanding and understanding the inference licenses which govern its use. So that's the target for attack. Now, going to slide 12. Well, in that case, said Prior, I can define the following connective tonk. The introduction rule is like that for OR. Tonk introduction. From A, infer, that is your license to infer A tonk B for arbitrary B. Right? That's like OR, right? That's similar to the introduction rule for OR. From A, you can infer A or B. The elimination rule is like that for AND. From A tonk B, infer, that is your license to infer B. Put these two together, and tonk licenses you to infer absolutely anything you like. Right? Well, this is absurd. And the moral that Prior wants to draw is that connectives should be defined in terms of their truth conditions, not their inferential roles, since otherwise there is no ban on the introduction of connectives that allow you to infer falsehoods from truths. Excuse me. Okay, that's Prior's paper, right? It's an attack on inferentialism. What he wants to argue by means of this brilliant little reductio is that inferentialism is wrong, and that to understand the logical connectives, we must understand their truth conditions, and that the inference rules are, so to speak, generated by the truth conditions and not vice versa. Okay. Now, inferentialists have responded by accepting, of course, that there is something radically wrong with tonk, but insisting that this doesn't refute inferentialism. The key paper here, the one usually cited, is one by Noel D. Belknap, but there are a lot of other inferentialists who've written about this issue. There's supposed to be a constraint on the introduction of connectives, and indeed all words in general, namely that the rules governing such connectives or such terms can only license conservative or harmonious extensions of the language. That is, they shouldn't license inferences to propositions not involving the new connective that were not licensed before. Right? That's the Belknap line. Now, there's a lot more to this. There are elaborate debates in the literature about concepts like conservativeness and harmony. And there's a big research program on the part of Michael Dummett in suggesting that conservativeness is not enough, we need harmony, and arguing, therefore, that there's something wrong with the classical logical connectives since they don't preserve harmony. We're not going to go into all that. It's important to know, one, that Prior struck a formidable blow against inferentialism, that it is not quite the knockdown argument that he hoped it would be, but nevertheless, it's a challenge which every inferentialist thinks that he or she should meet, and that it's shown at the very least that if we are going to understand connectives in terms of their inferential roles, there must be some very significant constraints on the introduction of such connectives. Right? Now, so far, it's been almost all the philosophy of logic. Now, moving on, however, let me just go through the problems. Problem for inferentialists, this is slide 14. If you're not going to help yourself to the notions of truth and falsehood, it's hard to see why harmony and conservativeness are so important. What's wrong with inferences to propositions not involving the new connectives that were not licensed before? Well, the inferentialist could reply, such inferences are liable to result in falsehoods. But a priorist response is, but if we need the threat of falsehood to motivate our concern for conservativeness, why not cut out the middleman and admit that that is what's really wrong with Tonk, i.e., that it licenses us to derive the false from the true. So what Prior would say, I think, is that either the concepts of truth and falsity are conceptually kosher, in which case there's no need to resort to conservativeness to explain what's wrong with Tonk as a connective, or they are not, in which case it's hard to motivate our concern for conservativeness. Okay, so I think that's where the debate lies. You know, I think Prior's winning on points by a considerable margin, but we don't need to absolutely settle the issue to think about the applications. Okay. It's agreed on all hands, this is slide 15, that there is something radically wrong with Tonkish terms, that one way of characterizing what is wrong with Tonk is that it confers a license to infer the false from the true. And inferentialists and truth condition theorists are agreed, Tonk does not express a genuine concept. It does not have a sense. They're both insistent on this, right? It doesn't have a genuine sense. Either it has no meaning at all, or if it does have a meaning, its meaning is not, as it were, respectable. So it's not a meaningful connective in the sense of standing for a respectable kind of concept. Right? It just doesn't. All right, slide 16. Now, moving on a bit to Dummett's famous book, Frege, The Philosophy of Language. It's an extremely thick book, and which I certainly do not claim to have read from cover to cover. However, there are some interesting parts, and one of the most interesting parts is Dummett uses the idea of a Tonkish term to characterize pejorative terms, particularly slurs and ethnic slurs. This is the confluence of two of Dummett's interests. On the one hand, he was a Frege scholar and a philosopher of logic and language. On the other hand, in his off-duty hours, he was a campaigner against racism. And there's a very famous preface to Frege, The Philosophy of Language, in which he says, well, you know, I was writing this book and then, you know, I kind of stopped because I felt it my duty to fight racism. And now that the battle against racism has been lost, I can return to subjects which are of no particular interest to it or anybody but philosophers. Oh, well, anyway, so he does develop an account of this. He uses, I think, on purpose, a kind of antique racial slur, not current at the time he was writing, kind of out of date. I think it's because had he used more up-to-date racial or ethnic slurs, it would have been a bit too near the knuckle. So it's the word Bosch, right? So Bosch introduction. From X is of German nationality, infer X is Bosch. And then we have Bosch elimination. From X is Bosch, infer X is barbarous or more prone to cruelty than other Europeans. So you have an introduction rule. From somebody is German, infer that they're Bosch. And you have an elimination rule. From somebody is Bosch, infer that person is barbarous or more prone to cruelty than other Europeans. So Tonkish terms are widely used as inference licenses of a kind, of course, that inferentialists would also disapprove since they're non-conservative, such that the inferences that they license you to draw are derogatory to some group or groups. And they can also, of course, lead from truths to falsehoods. Okay, that's another thing that's wrong with them. They lead from truths to falsehoods. You know, so we have, let's say, Herman, and he's of German nationality, But, you know, he's a paradigm of politeness, consideration, humanity, right? So the claim that he's barbarous and prone to cruelty is just false. Okay, so, and there's, you know, obviously the same mutatis mutandis for a whole range of racial and ethnic slurs, and not just racial or ethnic, you know, slurs of all kinds. So basically what Dummett has done is saying, look, here's a way of understanding what's wrong with pejorative terms. They are like tonk. And we all know, that is, if we've done a bit of philosophical logic, that that's a very bad way to be. You know, it's very bad to be like tonk. Okay. But they're like limited liability versions of tonk, right? Tonk is a complete runabout inference ticket. Given any expression as your premise, you can get to any expression as your conclusion. Tonkish terms as ordinary pejoratives are much more limited. You get a specific range of premises, allowing you to derive a specific range of conclusions. Right? So it's not like a complete runabout inference ticket. It allows you to run about a little bit. Right? It allows you to run about a little bit, but usually in a bad way. Okay, now we move on to slide 17. So here's my thesis. As commonly used, conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists are mega Tonkish. Not just Tonkish, mega Tonkish. Their use is characterized not by one, but by a number of different and potentially conflicting Tonkish rules, all of which can be used to take people from the true to the false. Slight qualification of the last one I'm going to discuss. Hence, they do not have respectable senses as defined by either truth conditions theorists or inferentialists. Right, now that's quite important, right? Because I've sometimes met the objection to my line, which is basically we should strip conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists of their pejorative connotations and define them simply as someone who, as a theory which posits a conspiracy, and as somebody who believes a theory which posits a conspiracy. You know, that's my recommendation. And the criticism I've met, refereeing papers in discussion, is that that doesn't represent current usage. Right? It doesn't represent current usage. It's, as it were, internal to our concept of conspiracy theory that there is something wrong with it. And any analysis which fails to capture that idea is ipso facto deficient. Right? Well, what I'm saying is you can't give a respectable analysis of the concept of conspiracy theory. You can't, because it's a Tonkish term, and Tonkish terms, as understood by either truth conditions theorists or inferentialists, do not determine genuine senses. We can talk about the inference rules that Tonkish terms license, but they do not determine coherent concepts. They do not determine respectable meanings. Right? So that's the first point. The second point is they do not have determinate, uncontested extensions. Right? Hence, conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists do not deliver, I should say, a set of phenomena suitable for psychological or social scientific investigation. So here, you know, I'm basically saying something similar to David Cody yesterday. Right? He wanted to argue that, you know, you can't use these terms in any way that's more or less consistent with the way they are actually used to deliver a set of theories or a set of people who are sufficiently determinate to be subject to psychological or social scientific investigation. So that's the point. All right, now, what are the rules? You might think there's only one here, but I'm going to argue there's more than one. So, well, you might think there's only two, right? One for conspiracy theory and one for conspiracy theorists. I think that there are more than one. In fact, I think the list that I'm going to give is not exhaustive. So, slide 18, Tonkish rules 1, conspiracy theory introduction. From this is a theory which posits a conspiracy, infer, that is, it's okay to infer, this is a conspiracy theory. So that's your introduction rule. And the elimination rule is, from this is a conspiracy theory, infer, that is, it is okay to infer this theory is false, crazy, or unbelievable. Now, why is this Tonkish? It leads us from truths to falsehoods, since many theories which posit a conspiracy are true, plausible, or such that it's rational to believe them. Also, of course, it's non-conservative. Right? It's not conservative according to Noel D. Belknap's conception of conservatism. So, you know, it's objectionably Tonkish, and that's whether you are a truth conditions theorist, or whether you are an inferentialist who sets a high value on conservatism. Okay. Now to the next slide, 19. Tonkish rules 2. Conspiracy theorist introduction. From this person believes a theory which posits a conspiracy, infer, that is, it's okay to infer, this is a conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy theory elimination. From this person is a conspiracy theorist, infer, that is, it's okay to infer, this person is crazy, silly, or irrational. And again, you know, it leads from truths to numerous falsehoods. If, as I've argued, every politically literate person subscribes to some theories which posit a conspiracy, then every politically literate person is a conspiracy theorist, but not every politically literate person is crazy, silly, or irrational. Maybe a minority, maybe a large minority, maybe even the majority, but surely not every single one. Right? So, you know, it leads from truths to falsehoods. All right, now you might think that that was it. Right? You might think that that was it. But actually, I think there are other rules which are being implicitly employed, which help to determine the meaning of conspiracy theory and conspiracy theories insofar as they have meanings, which, of course, if we accept either Pryor's views or those of the inferentialists, is not very far. Okay. Tonkish rules 3. Conspiracy theory introduction star. This is slide 20. From this is a theory which posits conspiracy to which I, or the epistemic authorities I respect, do not subscribe, infer, that is it is okay to infer, this is a conspiracy theory. From this is a conspiracy theory, infer, that is, it's okay to infer, this theory is false, crazy, or unbelievable. Now, notice that this licenses us to move from truths to falsehoods, since many theories which posit a conspiracy and are disbelieved by some speaker or their epistemic authorities, or the epistemic authorities that he or she respects, are true, plausible, or rationally unbelievable. You know, we can just select whatever damn crazy that you like, and that person will have epistemic authorities that they respect. They will deny some conspiracy theory, some theory which posits conspiracy theory, and therefore will describe it as a conspiracy theory. And but then they will draw the inference that it's crazy, but often it won't be crazy. Right? So we've already seen plenty of examples. The most obvious one would be the example of the idea that Saddam Hussein had conspired to acquire successfully conspired to acquire weapons of mass destruction, which posed a threat, a clear and present danger to either the United States or Britain and its allies, possibly by the use of Falsehood drones. Falsehood drones flying across Europe to drop napalm or something on London. Anyway, also, of course, it's non-conservative. More importantly, however, and this is worth emphasizing, the introduction rule is indexical, right? It starts off from what the speaker does not believe and what the speaker's epistemic authorities, which of course are relative to each person, does or does not believe. To this is a conspiracy theory, but then that's made to say that takes us to a general conclusion, a non-indexical conclusion. And that's obviously a fallacious move. All right, so Tonkis rules 3. And here again, we've got the corresponding rule for conspiracy theorist as opposed to conspiracy theory. So this is slide 21. From this person subscribes to a theory which posits conspiracy theory to which I or the epistemic authorities I respect do not subscribe, infer, that is, it's okay to infer this is a conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy theorist elimination, from this person is a conspiracy theorist, infer, that is, it's okay to infer this person is crazy, silly, or irrational. And this licenses moves from truths to falsehoods, since many people subscribe to theories which posit a conspiracy, which are disbelieved by some speaker or their epistemic authorities, but are nonetheless, of course, sane and epistemically respectable. So again, we have an introduction rule which starts from an indexical premise and an elimination rule which takes us to a general conclusion. Thus, it licenses people to move from indexical truths to general claims, which general claims stand a very good chance of being false. Now, you might think that that was it, but I think there's another rule which doesn't quite conform to the standard pattern, which is also operative here, which is also, in effect, determining the use of conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist. And it's not quite like the others, but I think it's very important in its effects. So this is slide 22. Tonkish rule 5, conspiracy theory negation introduction. So from this is a theory which posits conspiracy to which I or the epistemic authorities I respect do subscribe, infer, that is, it is okay to infer this is not a conspiracy theory, right? So posits conspiracy, but because I believe it or because the people I respect believe it, it's not a conspiracy theory. And in fact, people do this all the time. They posit theories involving conspiracy theories, but they don't admit to be a conspiracy theorist. Why? Well, because they're following this kind of Tonkish rule. But of course, you have the same elimination theory. From this is a conspiracy theory, infer this theory is false, crazy, or unbelievable. But of course, what happens here is this is a way of blocking the application of the conspiracy theory, it should be conspiracy theory elimination rule. It means it isn't self-applied because we're operating with conspiracy theory negation introduction. So this license is moves from truths to falsehoods. conspiracy theories are construed as theories which posit conspiracy theories, it's also non-conservative, but the rule is also implicitly indexical, but purports to deliver a general conclusion. But more importantly, of course, it muddies the waters by obscuring the affinities between the theories to which the speaker does subscribe and those to which he or she does not. So if you want to say that there's something wrong with conspiracy theories which have some further characteristic, which you might want to say, and your theory has this characteristic, the very fact that you believe it means that it's not a conspiracy theory, so it doesn't count. So, and here I'm sort of drawing to my conclusion. The basic idea is this. The terms conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist are used in a complex set of Tonkish ways. They are governed by a set of inference licenses. These licenses allow you to infer truths from falsehoods. They also mean that the term conspiracy theory doesn't have a determinate or uncontested extension. And the same is true, of course, of the term conspiracy theorist. That means that David Cody's claim is basically correct, that these terms do not have determinate, uncontested extensions. Since they don't have determinate or uncontested extensions, perhaps it would be putting it too strongly to say they are not a proper object for psychological or social scientific investigation. Maybe they are, but that investigation has to be governed by the realization that you don't have a determinate set of phenomena to investigate. And what you must be doing, therefore, is adopting much more sophisticated techniques if you're going to arrive at interesting and viable results. Right. Any attempt to discuss the psychological peculiarities of conspiracy theorists or the psychological defects manifest in conspiracy theories or manifest in the belief in conspiracy theories has to be based upon the realization that these do not constitute uncontested classes of phenomena, but rather, insofar as something is called a conspiracy theory, it may be so called by one person and not by another, and we do not have an uncontested class of things to discuss. Furthermore, I don't think there's any way to reconstruct the concept of a conspiracy theory which makes it intellectually respectable, except the radical one of totally depriving it of its pejorative connotations, as I've long recommended. But if you can't turn conspiracy theory as it is commonly used into the designation of a coherent and respectable concept. Reform and radical reform is the only option. And there I think I'll stop.
So Mark, do you want us to jump in with questions?
Yeah, please. Yeah, my video is not showing anymore, but go ahead.
Well, I see David's got his hand up, so I'll let him
So
go
could
first.
I just jump in because I've got to go, and I'm sorry I've stayed longer than I should anyway. But I just thought that was great, Charles. It occurred to me when you had Tonkish rules 3 and 4, there's maybe an even more radical kind of indexical elimination rule going on here. It's a while back now, but I remember when I first got interested in this, there's a journalist who writes for The Australian, which is the national Murdoch broadsheet here, called Glenn Milne, very right-wing kind of figure, and he accused, I can't remember who he accused now, but it was some left-wing politician, a Greens politician, I believe, of being a conspiracy theorist on the ground that she had cast doubt on whether the people who'd been convicted of the Lockerbie bombing, the Libyan intelligence agents, were really guilty. And that's all she'd said. She just didn't think the evidence was there. And it was quite striking that she was being accused of being a conspiracy theorist there because it was he who was asserting the conspiracy. She was questioning the conspiracy, yet she is the one who ends up being, branded a conspiracy theorist. And it just seemed to me, sort of the elimination rule in this case just seemed to be, this is not something I believe, therefore, so this is an instruction. Therefore, this is a conspiracy theory. And I think sometimes the reasoning just seems to go, that haywire.
Yeah. And one of the things I want to say is there isn't just one here, right? There's a whole bunch of inference tickets that people operate by, leading to just a terrible mess. So I think one you might say is less indexical, but is just obviously chauvinist. I don't say racist, it's not quite racist. Basically, conspiracy theories involving Western governments aren't conspiracy theories, are conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories put forward by Western governments about non-Western governments are not conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
That's another one which we could add to the mix. But probably if we went elsewhere, we could find other people using them in other ways.
Anyway, look, I've got to go, but thanks very much. See you, everyone.
Right.
Maybe I could jump in at this point, Charles. So look, I agree, all things being equal, it's not good that people are using conspiracy theory in a pejorative sense when they could be assessing conspiracy theories rationally. But I can't help worrying that you and David are just exaggerating the problem, that I think conspiracy theorists are well aware that there are these pejorative senses that are thrown against them, and they, they do what a lot of people do when they're subject to pejoratives. They attempt to throw them back. So while you were talking, I tried to Google to see if I could get any information about this. All I found was someone who makes the brand called Open Mind Conspiracy Theories T-shirts. So you can purchase a T-shirt, it turns out, that says, "If by conspiracy theorist you mean awake, then why, yes, I am." Okay, so I think like a lot of terms that have pejorative senses, people are not just sort of gullible sheep and are invariably going to fall into making inferential errors just because a pejorative has been thrown at them. They're going to contest those pejorative senses.
Yeah. Okay, and this relates to some of the stuff I was saying about Wittgensteinian inferentialism, whereby Wittgensteinian instrumentalism. So there's this idea that you find best expressed by Watson that scientific theories aren't theories in the sense of representations or purported representations of reality. What they are is inference licenses, very complicated sets of introduction and elimination rules. And the obvious thing you can say is, well, what if they deliver the wrong result? Right? Now, one thing you can say is, well, that's because they're not really true. You know, they deliver the wrong result in a fairly systematic way because they're not true, or they deliver the wrong result sometimes because they're like not quite right. They're true on the whole. They often give you the right result, but there's something wrong with them. They need to be reformed. They're truth-like, but they're not actually true. One can argue sometimes that the Tonkish inference license is justified if it's based upon a true or nearly true generalization. So, you know, we could go through these things and say, well, is this based on a true generalization? You know, are conspiracy theories usually crazy, right? And the answer is no, except in the sense that theories, you know, of any kind are often crazy. So they're not like specifically more crazy than other theories. So you could try and save them by saying, no, we're not using a Tonkish term. We are relying on a generalization, which is well supported. And if it isn't quite true, is true enough. I just don't think that that line is going to wash with any of these. Going back to the thing of, you know, revolting against Tonkish terms, well, yeah, people do this quite often. Queer is a term which was at least sometimes used pejoratively, and is now embraced, right? You know, so you can, given, you know, courage, guts, and persistence, change the meaning of a pejorative term. You can strip it of its pejorative connotations. You can even give it a positive connotation. That's possible, but you need to realize, if you want to do that, how it's actually working in current use so that you can lead a successful revolt. Is that an adequate answer? I'm not quite sure what it was.
Well, it's in the right ballpark of an adequate answer. I mean, I would just question whether you need to understand the fine details of the logic of the use of these pejorative terms before you revolt against them. I mean, as you point out with the case of queer, there's a long tradition of people opposing or reclaiming the use of pejoratives, and they seem quite successful. So it's not obvious to me that conspiracy theorists are these, you know, poor little shrinking violets that need philosophers to come in and save them from the evil influence of, you know, bad rhetoric. Maybe they are, but I'm just not terribly convinced.
Well, you don't need the concept of a Tonkish term to have a reasonably good understanding of how pejoratives work. It's just, it tends to help, right? And I think in particular, it helps sustain the idea that conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists do not constitute a coherent domain susceptible to the kinds of investigations that too many psychologists have tried to develop. So that's important, right? Don't think that you have an uncontested extension of this term. Because of the way the term is used by all sorts of people, the extension of the term is like a complete mess. People can put forward conspiracy theories, which are very like the conspiracy theories they don't like, but think of themselves as not conspiracy theorists, and indeed can denounce conspiracy theories on the part of other people. That, after all, I've argued is what was going on with the Gulf War. So I think it's illuminating. It's not the only path to illumination. It's not that someone who's never heard or thought about Tonk can't have a reasonably good understanding of these issues. It's just that I think that in this instance it's helpful. And I think also it would tend to work against some specific players in the debate. So I think it would be useful. I'm quite keen to see if I can use it against Qasim Qassam.
Right. Okay, now I think we're converging on agreement there.
Right. Yeah.
So if I can come in here. So I'm going to do a little bit of bad philosophy of science, in part because I'm going to be talking about how social scientists are doing some philosophy of science. And my bad characterizations here are all part of a journey to explain why some social science is doing some bad work. Because I was thinking, as you were talking about our Inference-Tickets and the like, this of course relates quite nicely to the realist, anti-realist debate we get in the science. And one thing that kind of struck me thinking about this, so if you're an anti-realist, then if people start making claims that theories are true or false, you think they're acting irrationally because they're just mere descriptions of states of affairs. And I sometimes get the impression that when social psychologists in particular are doing their analysis of this thing called conspiracy theory and belief in conspiracy theories, they're basically coming from an anti-realist perspective with respect to the term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist, whilst in an odd sense being a realist about this class of person called the conspiracist, the person who ends up believing in conspiracy theories. So they think they can study conspiracism because that's a real thing, but they take it that conspiracy theorists are people who believe in conspiracy theories, and as anti-realists about conspiracy theories, they of course have to be, by definition, acting irrationally because they're asserting that these theories are true. And as anti-realists, they should realize that actually conspiracy theories can't be true. They're just mere descriptions of events. And I would say this is bad philosophy of science. But I think to a certain extent, it explains what's going on in at least some of the social scientific work that we've interrogated at length in the past.
I'm not sure. I mean, of course, it does relate to realism and anti-realism in the philosophy of science. Wittgensteinian instrumentalism is clearly an anti-realist view.
Yeah.
I actually, started thinking about this, and then I reread Alan Musgrave's Wittgensteinian instrumentalism, which I totally recommend to everybody, and thought that he missed out using prior. In fact, I passed him a note the other day saying, reread your article, it was great, you should have used prior. And he wrote back saying, thank you for the compliment, yes, I should. Clearly Wittgenstein is in some deep sense skeptical about scientific reality. Superstition is the belief in the causal nexus. So what? Causal theories aren't causal powers aren't real. Things don't have genuine causal powers. Is that the claim? What I suspect motivates it, and I'm going to have to research this, is that Wittgenstein was prepared to take some statements as true because he had a very kind of cat on the mat conception of correspondence, and certain claims can represent reality in a fairly sort of flat-footed, straightforward sense. You know, we've got this stands for that, but that doesn't apply to theories composed of things like complex conditionals, or which posit dispositions. Those claims can't be true given his rather flat-footed conception of truth. So now he has to give a different theory of what they are and how they work. And of course, you know, one of the things that happened in the 20s and 30s is they were anti-truth freaks all over the place. They really didn't like the notions of truth or falsehood because they thought that might get you into real metaphysical trouble. And you find this, for example, in Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery. He sets the whole thing up and says, you know, you don't have to think that we need the notions of truth or falsity. You know, he's trying to sell the theory without truth or falsity. Then Tarski comes along and he thinks truth is okay, so now he can talk about it. Doesn't completely get him out of trouble, but you know, that's what happens. And Wittgenstein had the same kind of impulses. They were common among you know, the Vienna Circle. They didn't like truth. And so that is kind of forcing them in an anti-realist direction. Allen actually raises a similar objection to the inference license view of theories that Pryor raises against the inference license view of connectives. He says, well, you know, what about, let's say, a Nazi theory? Right? It's an inference license. It allows you to start from certain premises. Let's say this person is a theorist and they are non-Aryan, to the conclusion you shouldn't believe the science of, you know, the scientific theories of this person. That's an inference license. And, you know, it's endorsed by a community. Toulmin and Hansen are very strong inference license being endorsed by communities. So Allen says, well, what's wrong with that? And what the response has to be, oh, well, the predictions aren't verified. But then it seems we have a way of determining between inference licenses as to whether they produce reliable results, in which case we're kind of on the road to realism. Now, I've kind of maybe lost the thread here. What do I think about the social scientists? Are they like convinced not that conspiracy theories are likely to be false, but that the very question of their truth or falsity doesn't arise? That would be the radically anti-realist claim, right? In the sense of scientific realism, somebody who thinks that a whole bunch of theories are false, they're in a sense, they're not realists about whatever it is, but they've got the realist attitude. You know, there's the way the world is, and there's a fact of the matter about whether what we say corresponds to the way the world is. I don't know. I think that I would need to just look at more of the actual work to sort of pull out the philosophical underpinnings or the presuppositions, because these are frequently people who are not, you know, people make philosophical assumptions all the time without always being very clear that they're doing this. You know, you have to start asking them questions before you can pull out the assumptions and the presuppositions which are you know, driving their theorizing. So I just don't know.
Em, do you want to follow up at all? Or?
No, I'm still, I mean, it is an empirical question to go back to look at the actual literature. I just think in part, I think it might be the case that when social scientists are engaging in their discussion of this thing called conspiracy theory, they've got very different attitudes towards the thing which they want to study, which they will call conspiracist ideation. And the subjects they are studying, they think, suffer from conspiracist ideation, the conspiracy theorists who believe in conspiracy theories. So I sometimes think there's a weird double standard they have, that you can't believe in this thing, but we can study this thing over there. So it's almost as if they are being anti-realist about one thing, but realist about another.
Well, there's a common criticism that psychologists have a tendency to, as it were, pathologize people whether or not there's anything wrong with them. And this often involves not taking what they're thinking seriously, right? So there's the famous experiment of somebody who went to, I can't remember when this was conducted, but it's really funny. So they submitted themselves to a mental hospital as a voluntary patient, claiming that they were hearing voices. Now, they had no other symptoms. They claimed to have no other symptoms. And actually, it's not uncommon to hear voices, right? Quite a lot of people will hear voices at some stage, knowing, though, that they're not real. It's when you start not being sure that things really get problematic. Anyway, so the person said, look, I'm hearing voices. I'd like to come in and see what you can do for me. And all they were doing thereafter was looking at that, the way they were treated. And what I particularly engaged was they were taking notes on what the psychologists and the nurses were saying to them. And they looked at the note that was made on their charts by someone looking at them making notes, which was engages in writing behavior. Right.
Actually, I think it was compulsive.
Don't write something down, let alone
behavior.
What are they writing? Engages in writing behavior, which is to say, you know, this person is not having an intellectual process.
Oh, have we lost Charles there?
He's in very deep thought, it looks like, on this point. Hopefully he'll restart and jump back in.
Hopefully.
Yes, because
Oh,
one of the
we
things
just-
which is actually quite
oh, is he
interesting
back?
about
You're muted again, Charles.
Something
We
bad
lost you
happened.
there.
Yeah, lost.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, there is a tendency to, as it were, assume that you're the rational person and these people are just a bunch of crazies, or people whose, you know, thought processes needn't be taken seriously as potentially rational. And
So I should point out, so this study that we're talking about here has been looked at again, and there are now deep questions as to whether the researcher actually faked some of the data involved.
oh dear, right.
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's one of the many studies in psychology which is suffering
It's
from
facing a replication crisis.
Yeah,
Right. So we,
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
one of those stories that's a little too good to be true.
yeah. Well, you know, okay. But, you know, engages in conspiracy ideation. That means you simply think there might be conspiracy theories. Well, does that make you a proper subject of psychological study? Well, yes, in the sense that anything that people think is a proper object of psychological study. But just sort of routinely dismissing that you might be thinking that there are conspiracies partly because there really are conspiracy theories is the anti-realist move. Now the question is, are people making that move? There is something strong program in the sociology of science, Barnes and Bloor. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, they're now kind of receding into the past. they were very keen that the sociology of science was self-reflexive. And that the odd part of that was it meant that they treated themselves as irrational as the people they were studying. Very strange. But I can't remember that sufficiently to come back to it.
Charles, I think they run the symmetry thesis, the idea that whether or not a theory is true or false, one should study it exactly the same way.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So
that's the one.
They
you're
sound
right.
more like a Van Fraassen type anti-realist than a thoroughgoing anti-realist.
Yeah, except it's Van Fraassen at least would be able to say, well, of course, I'm not going to. It's not that I really think we can know it's true. All I can reasonably believe is that it's empirically adequate. But they're not doing that. They're saying something else. They're saying, look, whether they're true or whether or not they're empirically adequate, we study them in exactly the same way. And so, it is a bit like Van Fraassen, but in fact, Van Fraassen.
Right. But I just mean it's like them. It's like Van Fraassen in their acknowledging that the subject matter might be true. They're just making the further inference, but we don't care. Yeah,
which is odd. I mean, the belief that I have the belief that I own a hybrid car, an Aqua, well, surely there's a difference between my believing that, given that I do have it, and my believing that if I didn't have it. You'd have to give different kinds of causal explanations for the beliefs, depending on whether or not I genuinely have such a car or whether I do not.
Right, but I mean, their further claim, I think, and it's a while since I looked at this stuff, is that the scientists in question, they doubt that they're motivated by actually trying to find the truth. They claim that the scientists are motivated by seeking promotion and glory and so forth. And they care no more about the truth than Barnes and Bloor do. That seems to be the story.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and you're right. It was a symmetry thesis that I was misremembering. So yes, they do claim that, and what depends upon what's actually going down in the lab, and you have to have a different explanation if one thing's happening than if another thing's happening. At least if you're trying to do a causal explanation. And there is maybe the confusion between, if you think reasons can be causes or causes can be reasons, I form a belief in a rational way. That doesn't mean it's uncaused. It's just that the causal story of my belief formation measures up to some conception of rationality. That doesn't mean it's uncaused. So some people seem to think that if I give a causal explanation, it's not a rational explanation. But of course, that's not true.
Yeah.
So, Charles, can I jump in? I have a couple of different reactions to your talk. One is, the one takeaway that I can get from you and David together is this idea that maybe our advice to social scientists, particularly social psychologists, is don't take yourself to be studying the type conspiracy theory for the reasons that you've just laid out, that there is no coherent type, but instead restrict your studies to why do people believe in, say, QAnon, or why do people believe in the particular conspiracy, be more particularist with the way in which you characterize what it is that you're doing. You're trying to figure out the relationship between people who believe in QAnon and their religious beliefs, and then just leave it at that. Don't draw from that then a conclusion about conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theories more generally. And is that one way of thinking about? Would you be satisfied if somebody said, I'm not writing a critique of conspiracy theorists, I'm writing a critique of people who, have a certain particular attitude about what happened on 9/11.
Yeah, that would be perfectly okay. And also, if you were cautious and careful, you could extend it, right? You could say, okay, I think those people who believe QAnon are similar in some specific way to those people, who believe in a non-standard 9/11 conspiracy theory. You might be able to do that, but you have to do it like piecemeal. You can't just say, oh, well, they're conspiracy theorists, so they're going to be psychologically similar. It might be that they're psychologically quite distinct. And even if they are, you just, you have to do it carefully on a case-by-case basis. You can then maybe build up interesting generalizations, i.e. conspiracy theorists of a certain kind, i.e. believing in a certain range of conspiracy theories, which have certain characteristics, themselves share certain characteristics. That's a possible, that's something you might arrive at by, careful social psychological inquiry, right? It's something that you might do, but you have to be extremely careful about, as it were, taking the category of conspiracy or conspiracy theorists from the general culture and then just generalizing upon it, because it's created by these, well, insofar as it exists, it's created by all these dodgy Tonkish inference licenses.
I mean, one concrete example, I think, of something maybe you might agree with is around the 9/11 story. One thing that somebody, it's a scholar at, I'm blanking on the name, it's a neuroscientist that I talked to at George Mason University, and he was interested in the thesis. I don't think he ever did any work on this, but he just talked to me about it, and he was curious what I thought about this thesis. Is that one of the things that struck him was that he noticed that a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people who were located in Europe were more likely to believe, in his experience, that the 9/11 conspiracy theory that the Pentagon was not hit by an airplane, but was in fact hit by a missile. And he said, it's really interesting when I talk to Americans, they find that idea just ludicrous, whereas a lot of Europeans take it very, very seriously. And he thought it was correlated with the fact that a lot of Europeans are under the impression that the Pentagon is somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, that it's very rurally located. As opposed to most Americans, that it's actually located in a very populous part of the country. It's like 8 miles from the White House, such that it leads to the license, the idea that, the reason why Americans maybe don't believe that that the Pentagon was hit by a missile as opposed to a plane is that they know that, well, there's no way that hundreds, if not thousands of people saw that plane fly over and hit the Pentagon. All those people that were in rush hour traffic who witnessed it said, I saw a plane fly over. And then, maybe I didn't see it hit, but I saw a plane right before the explosion I saw. Whereas most Europeans were just completely boggled by the idea of like, what? I thought it was out in the woods somewhere, right? That there were not very many people who would have seen it. Such that, there might be a correlation between two different kinds of beliefs, one of which is false, that leads to another false belief. And it's like, you might be able to get social psychologists to tell a kind of a particular story about like, why is a particular conspiracy theory popular in one area versus another? Well, it's because it's correlated with another belief that may have its own origins due to what they know there.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting case. You're just visualizing something quite different.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're visualizing a building out in the boondocks, a very big building, of course, then the episode would not have been witnessed by so many people, and in which case the testimony of a small number of people could have been influenced in all sorts of ways. Mm-hmm. But if the larger the group, the harder it is to fake it so that they all see the same thing.
And this is related to my worry about. So one thing is as you develop this paper, the thing that I bumped on is when you made the shift from the original sense of Tonkishness I guess it was Pryor and others that used it originally, talking about and or, conjoining the elimination rule with and with the addition rule of or. And then you made the shift to talking about conspiracy theories as Tonkish terms. Bumped on when you made that move is that in the original use of the term Tonkish, I mean, there's not very much involved in the rule beyond what's written on the page, right? It's literal elimination of an and symbol or a literal addition of a statement. Whereas in the conspiracy theory versions, you've got like things like, reputable people who believe with me, or usually some reference to an official story. Yes. And that's got a lot of other stuff packed into it. In that, what somebody who makes the kind of claim that's a conspiracy theory, and therefore you should not be believed, they might take themselves to not be making a mere Tonkish elimination claim. They're saying, no, there's an unexpressed shorthand for all the evidence that, did you read the official account? Do you know that the Pentagon is located in the middle of a pretty populous area? All the other stuff that comes along with it, such that the reason why I think your view should be rejected is not because I'm making a quick Tonkish elimination, is that, well, I just don't have time, or maybe I don't want to go into the time of laying out all the evidence on one side, and as opposed to, there's just a lot more going on there than merely a Tonkish elimination. And I just worry that you might be stretching the notion of a Tonkish term a little bit by making that move from one to the other.
I did know that the Pentagon is in the Washington area, and so it's in a fairly popular. Is it actually in DC, or is it in Maryland or Virginia or someplace?
It's in Maryland. Well, no, it's not Maryland. Where is it at? Virginia. I think isn't it in the part of the? It's in the part of. If Washington D.C. had been the square that it was supposed to be, it would have been inside of that square, but because I think the state of Virginia refused to allow their property to be actually used as part of the building. But it's like I said, it's like 8 miles from the White House. Right. It's really close.
Yeah, I knew that. I was just idle curiosity. Actually, in DC or in Virginia or Maryland, because I know Washington's right on the border there.
Yeah.
So so that was just idle curiosity.
Yeah.
Well, one point, of course, and this relates to the charge of Tonkishness. You could say, well, I'm not using this term Tonkishly. It's an enthymeme, right? It's not a Tonkish inference, it's an enthymeme. I've got the claim, let's say, that conspiracy, that this is a theory which postulates conspiracy theory. Therefore, it's conspiracy. Therefore, it's a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories are systematically, almost always irrational to believe or silly. Therefore, this is probably irrational to believe or silly, right? So you could say, well, look, no, these are enthymemes. These aren't Tonkish uses. These are enthematic arguments. And then the question is, well, is the missing premise an intellectually defensible premise? And I would argue that in most cases it isn't. And in fact, when challenged, people can't defend the missing premise that you need to make the argument either valid or nearly valid. You've got a broad generalization, which is true vast majority of times. So you can infer, this is an X, X's are almost always Y, so this is probably Y, very probably Y. That's fine. We're not going to bicker about that. And the claim I would be is that the enthymemes are usually the missing premises are usually not defensible. Maybe there are some uses where they are, but generally not. And you know, when you challenge the missing premises, people can't come up with an adequate defense. And they often look pretty stupid. So that's one reason for thinking of them as Tonkish terms. Now, could one say, look, the idea that the Pentagon was hit by a missile, not by a plane, is just silly because so many saw the plane and saw it flying over and then either saw the explosion or actually saw the hit, right? And they didn't see a missile. And then there are all these pictures of a wrecked plane. That's a specific objection to a specific version of a specific conspiracy theory, and you know it's perfectly fine. You don't, but somebody who just said, "Well, I don't believe that because, you know, I know all these people in Washington, if I wasn't in Washington myself, who were there at the time that it hit, and they all say the same thing. So this theory isn't you know, plausible." That's all perfectly fine, but that's not using some of these Tonkish tactics. I suppose your point might be, well, it looks as though they're doing that, but they aren't really. Well, sometimes that might be true, yes. So somebody might have not very well formulated, but once you've formulated them, perfectly adequate grounds, reasons for skepticism about a given conspiracy theory, and they might carelessly express themselves in such a way as you might think they're using the term Tonkishly, but in fact, no, you know, they've got a coherent argument available to them if they thought it through and bothered to express themselves. Yeah, sure, that can happen. Yeah.
So by the way, I plugged a map into the chat if you're curious of
Right.
the location. Actually, it makes it look like about 4 miles away. Maybe it's 8 kilometers. Maybe that's probably closer to right. But
Yeah,
the last thing I would say is this, and this is, I mean, I almost wonder whether your analysis of the use of the pejorative here. I mean, there might be less going on in the pejorative than you're giving it credit for, which
right.
is that I think the use of the term conspiracy theory in that pejorative sense is actually the speech act. It's more of a speech act that means I don't want to talk to you anymore. Like, you know, right. Or I'm not going to dignify that with a reasoned answer. That you're presenting it as if it is a kind of a reasoned answer. Like, hey, I'm giving a logical argument by which I show that you are not to be believed. Whereas I think it's actually a speech act that often just means I can't, you know, it's like the term balderdash or poppycock. I mean, if I call your view, I don't need, you know, I'm sorry, Charles, your view is not wrong. Your view is poppycock. That use of the pejorative is just like, you know, end of conversation. You're not even worth talking to. These ideas aren't even worth engaging with, which itself is problematic. I mean, that's to make it particularly if you're making that against a political opponent, right? That is a particularly negative assessment of your opponent that maybe is uncalled for. But I mean, I think it's often intended as a conversation stopper. The way that somebody using, you know, claiming, oh, that's just fake news. Certainly the way Donald Trump uses the phrase fake news, it's supposed to be a conversation stopper. I am not going to dignify this with any further response. I'm just going to call it fake news and move on to the next question.
Yeah, that is sometimes true. The problem is, well, I mean, it's used as a conversation stopper. If something is used as a conversation stopper and that conversation stopper helps to determine the extension of a term that is then uncritically used by, let's say, social psychologists, then there's a problem. If it's just a conversation stopper, there is the problem about, you know, when and how we should engage with people who don't strike us as very rational. On the one hand, there's a world enough and time problem. And on the other hand, you're kind of dehumanizing somebody when you don't take them seriously. So I have a general complaint against Wittgensteinian philosophy that it consists in dehumanizing people by pretending that they don't make sense. And I think it's morally objectionable, as well as intellectually objectionable in the sense that they don't have a good theory about when things do or do not make sense. But you don't want to say, I can never say, I'm fed up with you talking to you lunatic. You want to be able to say that because sometimes people are pretty irrational and you just don't have time to engage with them. So with these kinds of rhetorical techniques and these sort of conversational stoppers, I don't want to say nobody should ever use them, but you should be a bit careful if you find yourself doing them too much. And if, as I say, these speech acts bleed over into serious social sciences, then I think there's a problem.
All right, guys, I think it might be time to wrap things up. But let me say thank you to Charles for a lovely talk and to the panelists for an excellent round of conversation again. And sadly, we're drawing to a close here in our colloquium series on the philosophy of conspiracy theory. And let me just say a double thanks to all the participants for serving both as primary lecturers and also as respondents for the talks. And it's been a great series and I hope benefit to you. It's definitely benefit to our students and to myself. And let's keep in touch, and I'll be in touch with each of you about bureaucratic matters in the near future. But a big thanks to each of you for your willingness to participate in the colloquium series. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And thanks to you, Mark, for organising.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's talk again soon, and have a good morning / night or wherever you are, to everyone.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Bye.